Welcome to State of the World with me, Sally Lockwood in Dubai.
And I'm Ryan Heath, joining from New York in place of Tara Palmieri.
Great to see you, Ryan. Thanks so much for standing in. Big shoes to fill.
Well, I'll do my best and we will make a tour of the world and have a lot of fun doing it, Sally.
Ryan Heath is formerly Politico, formerly Axios, a journalist as well, and has recently gone independent, and is also a good friend of mine and Tara's, we should also mention for full disclosure. But the great thing about having you on, Ryan, is that obviously Tara lives and breathes the Washington bubble. She knows so much. I'm always so impressed by how much she knows with her sources and contacts and exclusives. But I always feel like that with you when it comes to more the kind of world view. And that's because you were based in Brussels for many years with Politico, right? And you're just a bit of an encyclopedic brain in general. So for that reason, we're kind of going to do a slight roundup of Donald Trump's foreign policies and some of his recent decisions and how that's impacting lots of things that are going on in the world right now.
Absolutely.
Sound good?
And as an Australian, I'm the friendly foreigner. So people like to open up to me where maybe they wouldn't to people from the bigger powers.
So let's kick off with the White House meetings between the Israeli Prime Minister and Donald Trump. That's his third visit, I think, since Trump returned to office. And there just wasn't the big announcement that I think many of us expected when it came to this ceasefire in Gaza.
You mean being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize wasn't Trump's goal this week, Sally? Come on, that's what he wanted out of this. Of course, he would also like a ceasefire. And I'll be honest, it was a lot of business and less spectacle than I imagined this week. But that also tells you that they didn't really squeeze the lemon very effectively over this debate. They haven't reached a turning point. There's no effective ceasefire. And it's really hard to do that if Netanyahu won't move any of his red lines and there's only one of the two warring parties at the table. So I'm not surprised that they didn't get more out of these meetings. I am a little surprised that I think Trump realizes it's time to get a result, and that's why there was a bit less spectacle this week than we're used to.
Yeah, I think the choreography is interesting, isn't it? You sound so cynical, by the way, talking about his Nobel Peace Prize nomination. Of course, that is something that...
I mean, it was great theater from Netanyahu. He knows how to play his cards well. He plays to the MAGA base perfectly, but you don't achieve a ceasefire with Gaza by playing to the MAGA base. You've got to have a broader audience than that.
Yeah, and there were a lot of comments as well about the fact that Donald Trump received this nomination from someone who has an arrest warrant out by the International Criminal Court. But perhaps this was choreographed and was planned all along. I don't want to sound as cynical as you, but there was the ceasefire between Israel and Iran, which Donald Trump made clear he wanted to happen and has happened. Then there's been this visit, this Nobel Peace Prize nomination. And I imagine that part of the plan was to announce a ceasefire in Gaza this week, but it's just not that simple. It's not as simple as a post on Truth Social negotiating the terms of something so complex and so significant for two warring parties. And it does sound like the indirect talks between Hamas and Israeli negotiators that are taking place in Qatar are really bearing no fruit after 3 days.
Yeah, this isn't a thing you can just split the difference over, and the sequencing really matters. So in what order will the troops be withdrawn, the hostages released? How and when will the aid be able to reach the people who are most vulnerable in Gaza? All of that has to be choreographed down to the millisecond, and that's extremely hard to do with the parties involved in this sort of discussion.
Yeah, and I thought it was very interesting that Donald Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, he said there was just one sticking point that remained in these negotiations, and that was the issue of Israeli troops being withdrawn from Gaza. Well, it turns out it doesn't seem that it was just one sticking point. Aid also has not been agreed either. And a senior member of the UN who works on Gaza, in Gaza, said to me that the aid situation is absolutely no clearer for them. They have not been given any indication that they would have more access, that they would be able to get more aid in. And he also said to me that actually his suspicion is that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, this controversial body that was launched around a month and a half ago to distribute aid in Gaza using US security contractors instead of aid organizations like the UN, which has proved extremely controversial. Hundreds of people have been reported to have been killed trying to get to these aid sites. And this source at the UN said to me, that their suspicion is that the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, will form the core element of aid even after a ceasefire, which many people will be very unhappy about.
And whether it is the foundation or the UN or anyone else delivering the aid, what's most critical in those situations is security that goes alongside the access. If you have just access, but you're at the mercy of Israel's very extensive range of weapons, then the aid doesn't reach the people it needs. Either the aid workers, deliverers, or the people trying to receive the aid remain at risk. The death toll that you have spoken about, it becomes a bit meaningless, and the conflict remains frozen. And really, at the end of the day, Israel wants full control of Gaza. And the trick is, how do you dress that up to make that somehow acceptable to people in Gaza and the international community? And I think until Israel sort of is a little bit more upfront about what it really is prepared to accept, then we're not going to get any form of unfreezing of this situation.
Let's talk about the comments by Israel Katz, the Israeli defense minister, who's talked about creating a humanitarian city on the ruins of Rafah, essentially screening Palestinian civilians and building some sort of camp so that they would therefore live inside this humanitarian city, which they wouldn't be able to get out of, the idea being that they'd been security cleared and weren't part of Hamas, but they wouldn't be able to get out. Essentially, it would be a humanitarian prison. That's caused a lot of outrage, certainly in this region. The spotlight is certainly back on the forced displacement of Palestinians, something that Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu discussed on his first visit to the White House. And it was something that Donald Trump floated as an idea very publicly at a press conference, and it shocked a lot of people, building this Riviera in the Middle East and moving Palestinians from Gaza to somewhere else. What is the reaction to those comments this week in the US, Ryan?
I'm fairly muted, to be honest. A lot of these discussions are the logical endpoint of policies and visions that the players here have been having since the 1990s, and they've just slowly edged further and further towards those sort of statements. But I'll be really honest with you, Donald Trump sucks up the oxygen from many directions. We're going to talk about some of those other issues later on in the podcast. The Middle East feels still very distant from the daily lives of many Americans. And these seem like the sort of details that blur into the rest. So there hasn't been a moment where people had a collective intake of breath or said, wow, he's finally gone too far this time, or somebody broke away from his coalition inside the Republican Party. Those comments, noted, somehow internalized as quite extreme, but really no specific political reaction here in the US this week.
Quick question on the UN Special Rapporteur for Palestine, Francesca Albanese, who has now been put on a US sanctions list, Ryan.
Yep.
Why?
Well, she represents the United Nations, and Donald Trump is no friend of the United Nations. And essentially, if you are not fully lined up with the Netanyahu government, you are potentially a target of this administration. And of course, Francesca's ability to be in the US, to operate in the US from the United Nations headquarters, at some level depends on the grace of the Trump administration. They control the borders. That's the signature policy of this entire administration. And for them to show that Francesca Albanese isn't going to do what she used to do, isn't going to enjoy the freedom of movement that a diplomat or a diplomatic negotiator would normally have, is another way for Trump to demonstrate his ability to control this situation and to control the narrative of what happens with Israel and Gaza. So it's largely symbolic. It's not going to change her ability to communicate with the people she needs to communicate with, but it is a way of saying, I'm in charge and I don't like you or the United Nations.
Meanwhile, while these symbolic gestures are made by powerful men like Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, there are 50 remaining hostages in Gaza, more than 57,000 Palestinians killed. And, the situation just sounds dire. I heard from a family in Gaza just this afternoon who are in touch with me when they can be. There's not always secure internet anymore. It's very unstable. And they said that internet's been super patchy lately. And honestly, things here are really terrible and scary. It keeps getting worse. Now, even people in Khan Yunis, the so-called safe zone, are being forced to evacuate again. It's heartbreaking. Now, they've got 3 children, one of whom is a very young baby, and the baby is now suffering from malnutrition.
Yeah.
That's
a reminder not to be glib about the prospect of a ceasefire. I can sound very cynical sometimes, but if you're the mother in this situation with a child who is essentially starving, any form of ceasefire is possibly a lifeline. And so we have to remember that. But at the same time, when you look at the overall picture, it doesn't feel like there's been big sustainable movement this week.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is not how I like doing journalism remotely like this. Obviously, international journalists don't have access to Gaza, so we are doing what we can to rely on sources from inside. But I think it's always worth remembering and reminding that when we're discussing these political negotiations and meetings and symbolic gestures, that there are real people's lives at stake. And they are living in absolute hell at the moment and have been for 20 months. Oh, it's heavy, isn't it? Let's move on. Let's move on to Ukraine, because
what a ray of sunshine you are, Sally. It's all great.
I know. No one listens to this podcast to be cheered up. I'm really sorry. I'd love to have more good news. But Zelensky said that Ukraine was hit by its largest ever aerial attack this week. The noises that Putin has made about wanting peace and a ceasefire, I think even Donald Trump now has realized are absolute rubbish. And it's been really interesting, the change in tone from him when he talks about Putin, Ryan.
Yes, absolutely. So Trump this week basically just said all Putin wants to do is kill people.
I'm not happy with Putin. I can tell you that much right now, because he's killing a lot of people. We want to put defensive weapons because Putin is not treating human beings right. He's killing too many people. So we're sending some defensive weapons to Ukraine, and I've approved that.
So who ordered the pause last week?
I don't know. What did you tell me?
That's a very Trumpian way to reduce a complex topic. But the bones of that is true. I don't think that there is a lot of evidence to suggest otherwise. Russia's military machine and Russia's history suggests it's a country willing to tolerate a lot of individual pain, willing to sacrifice a lot of individual lives at the altar of what is state glory or state success. And we're seeing that repeated in a specific context now in Ukraine, but the broad outlines are pretty similar to what we've seen at other times in Russian history. And, Donald Trump, he hasn't been doing this his whole life, but I think he's seen enough of it now to know that it's not going to be a simple negotiation with Putin. Again, not something where you can just split the difference.
Yeah, it seems like he's finally seen Putin's true colors, and that actually he can finally now see through, the rhetoric, and actually the actions speak for themselves. But Donald Trump also announced that he was going to send more weapons to Kyiv this week,
which has been... Words don't help. Weapons help in this situation. So
it's true, which has been really welcomed. He reversed a decision to stop sending weapons, which he says he didn't know about. And I thought his comments about Putin, where he said, we get a lot of BS thrown at us by Putin. He's very nice to us all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless. So I think Donald Trump's also realised that negotiating this peace deal in Ukraine, which he thought he would be able to do so easily, is just not proving to be possible. And it seems like the Vatican have offered some sort of invitation to try and step in.
Yes. So it's not unprecedented, but the point here is that We haven't seen a lot of success when the EU has gotten involved. We haven't seen success from successive US administrations. So the Vatican stepping in is one of the few alternatives. We did see a little bit of success when Erdogan in Turkey tried to broker some of those grain shipments a couple of years ago. But anyway, the point is the Vatican knows how to play a long game. It's a neutral venue. It does have the capacity and the tools to do discreet diplomacy. So I don't think the Vatican is going to negotiate the end of the war between Russia and Ukraine, but it might create the space to build up some trust. And that, of course, is welcome. Very, very small crumbs, but otherwise there are no crumbs. So we have to look for the crumbs wherever we can at this point.
Okay, let's move on to the next thing we wanted to touch on, which is minerals deals, Ryan. So, of course, there were those widely publicized minerals deals done with Ukraine in order to ensure some sort of security for them against Russia. We remember that meltdown Donald Trump had with Zelensky, I think back in February, very publicly in the Oval Office, which preceded those minerals deals being done. And it seems that is providing a bit of a blueprint for other deals with other countries.
Yes. So this is, if you like, a halfway house between how Donald Trump approaches hot conflicts like Ukraine and how he is approaching trade negotiations, which is the broader tariff question. And so he held a summit recently with West African leaders. And really the point of this is to say, okay, we're ditching USAID and essentially all of the US foreign development and aid programs, and we're going to lean into trade. And the way we're going to do that is through these kind of minerals for security deals. Now that potentially is interesting. The US does have the world's strongest military. But if you are going to inject that sort of military presence into a situation of fragile institutions in very young democracies or countries that aren't really democracies at all, you have a lot of capacity to mess up that system. And Africa, it wants investment, but at what price? Is this a kind of 21st century colonialism? That's certainly how it felt, sort of the contours and the vibes around the Ukraine deal. And if this is just another form of colonialism, then maybe it feels like a short-term win in the US. But we know that colonialism stores up sort of consequences. There's a price to pay, even if that price isn't on whatever deal is getting agreed in 2025.
And I guess the cynic in me, Ryan, would say, isn't this just exploitation? You've got these vulnerable countries who have very, very poor economies. They need aid, they need military assistance, they have various threats from rebels or terrorist groups. And the US is coming in and saying, well, we can help you, but we want something in return.
Absolutely. And in return means getting all of the critical minerals that are going to make our electric vehicles, our smartphones, and so on. That's really, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is, will your iPhone and other devices like that work in a couple of years' time? And that is something that Trump doesn't think is a political price worth paying. The idea that all of our connected devices and the way that we socially operate, he does not want that going up in smoke, because that would be a threat to his administration, and it would be a threat to US stability. And we know that he's willing to put that ahead of anything else.
And this all comes in the same week that USAID closed its doors for the final time, Ryan.
Yep, that's a really tricky one. I know many people personally who've been laid off. There are, examples of really, really successful programs that even when they were created, either in partnership with organizations like the Gates Foundation or sort of from an organic sense out of the US government itself, they have literally saved hundreds of thousands of lives. You can ask legitimate questions. A country like South Africa, it probably should be able to fund its own HIV prevention and management programs at this point. So I'm not saying there isn't a legitimate debate to be had, but the idea that you can just withdraw money from extremely successful programs from very, very vulnerable people, it's a political winner for the MAGA base here in the United States. But, again, you store up the consequences of policies and actions like this, and we won't know what those consequences are going to be in full for a while yet. But it's definitely very real, from the job losses in Washington and other cities in the US through to the lives damaged and lost in continents like Africa.
I think for many, it was a sad day when a USAID closed completely, because I think there was a hope that it would be reinstated after Elon Musk left the administration. And is his Doge department still open, by the way?
Yes, it operates. It's only a task force, really. It's had some success in cutting spending, but I think the really important thing to follow here is the numbers. Like, as journalists, we shouldn't be swayed by what seems the most dramatic or whatever the latest theater of the day is. If you really withdraw the scope and look at the whole picture, the biggest items in the US budget are military, social security, and healthcare spending. And if you aren't addressing the fundamental systems there, then you're really not cutting the spending dramatically. So elements of the US government, like USAID, are really drops in the bucket. This is not making a big difference to America's debt, which continues to rise. The big bill that Trump had passed on July 4, that will increase the debt overall, not shrink it. And so any claims around government efficiency and looking after Americans first need to be seen in that broader context, that government spending is still going up and American debt is still rising.
Okay. And speaking of the economy, that takes me neatly onto the last issue we want to touch on, which is tariffs.
Yep.
They were the, what were they called? The retaliatory tariffs? Is that what they were known as?
Yes, and it was announced on Liberation Day, which otherwise was known as April Fool's Day.
Right. God, it feels years ago. It was probably, 3 months? Yeah, it was 3 months ago, because Donald Trump hit pause on these retaliatory tariffs against all these countries around the world, including many friendly countries like Europe and the UK and the UAE. I mean, I think countries have been affected everywhere, and there was a lot of panic, and the markets delivered their verdict, which was not good. And Donald Trump hit pause for 3 months on these tariffs, which were due to come in. That deadline was this week, and he's kicked the can down the road again till the 1st of August.
Yes, for most countries. So there was a list of about 14 countries who have had their revised tariff rates issued, broadly speaking the same. There hasn't been a lot of movement. The reason there hasn't been a lot of movement is countries haven't struck the deals that Donald Trump said they would be racing to strike with the United States. I think there's been 2. The UK and Vietnam have struck relatively minor deals. Everyone else is sort of stuck in the same sort of zone of confusion and wanting to get something different out of the US and the administration not really willing to budge. And so what we're really talking about here is not just the theater of all of us talking every week about Trump tariffs. He's brilliant at that. He stage manages that like the best Broadway producer you can imagine. But it really is a reordering of the structure of globalization as we've known it. So think about something like the whole point of trade is that you, in whatever country you're in, make the things that you're good at because you have a competitive advantage. And it makes sense for global production of whatever that thing is or whatever that service is to happen in your country because you're good at it or you've got access to the resources to do it cheaply. If Trump can just remove that advantage at the stroke of a pen, then what is competitive advantage? What is the basis of trade anymore? So it really is a potential fundamental reordering of the economy.
Now, economists have argued that any reaction to tariffs, such as inflation and lost jobs, will be delayed. What's been the impact so far, or has it been kind of minimal because of this pause? And are they still popular in the US overall?
The tariffs, it's a completely split picture politically there. The biggest impact here is that interest rates are not coming down. So many people, including myself, made a bet on mortgages a couple of years ago that they would be able to renegotiate because by now interest rates would be coming down. Inflation would be under control. There would be some slowing in the economy and the jobs market, and therefore we would be getting lower interest rates and our houses would be more affordable. But because the tariffs keep that threat of inflation around, the Federal Reserve, which controls the interest rates, they're not willing to cut. So a lot of people are finding that they're just stuck on unaffordable mortgages. And then that's when you start to really get big cost of living problems. It's one thing for eggs to cost too much, which was the big criticism of Biden, or the petrol, the gas you use to fill up your car. Yeah, that was a tough time. It was expensive. It's a whole other thing when your mortgage is too expensive and you maybe don't have a roof over your head, or you have to give up your biggest asset, which you were counting on in retirement. So if Trump kind of can't figure out a way to keep this inflation under control, he's also storing up problems there on cost of living.
Ryan, this has been great. Thanks so much for your world roundup. I mean, no matter how concerned people might be about the economy, certainly Donald Trump is providing a lot of content.
That is always the case. And like Tara Palmieri, who will be back next week with more content, it's just a pleasure to chat about all of these issues. As tough and dramatic as they can be, I'm glad we're talking about them, and I'm glad you're all listening to them.
Yeah, Ryan, it's been so great to have you on. Thank you so much. And as Ryan said, Tara will be back with me next week for our next episode, so do tune in for that. If you don't subscribe already, please hit subscribe at the top of the screen. It's free, and you'll see when all our updates and episodes drop. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for the support. Please like the show, leave a comment, share this with your friends. It makes a big difference to us in terms of how the channel grows, and we really appreciate you watching. And thanks so much to Ryan Heath for standing in for Tara this week.
Always a pleasure, Sally.